This video is brought to you by my lovely patrons and sponsored by channelfireball.com. Use code SPICE at the checkout whenever you are booking any Grand Prix, Fnatic packages, or command zones at cfbevents.com to let them know that I sent you and to help out the channel even more. Also, I have a PO box now. The address is in the description. Please only send me illegal things if they're really cool. Okay, I think that's everything. Let's get into the video. Hello, spicy people of the internet. My name is Spice8Rack, aka your dangerously handsome but frustratingly boring neighbor, and I'd like to talk about an aspect of art and entertainment that I care very deeply about. As a massive fan of the lore of Magic the Gathering, there's a looming issue that has been plaguing the story for almost 2 years now, and it's left a lot of established fans feeling like they're not being listened to, and many potential new fans unenthusiastic to pursue this aspect of the game. No, it's not the lack of communist Goblin representation, please get out of my head. It is a notable and disappointing drop-off in accessibility. But what is accessibility and how does it pertain to Magic the Gathering story? In a basic sense, when people say accessibility, they mean how easy is it for someone to get into something. Employing BSL or ASL interpreters during conferences makes what's being said more accessible to deaf and hard of hearing audiences. For example, Settlers of Catan is a more accessible board game than Twilight Imperium, for example. Twitter provides an accessible forum for anyone with an internet connection to feel crushing anxiety and rage as they slowly find out that most of their childhood heroes are utter bastards. You get what I mean when I say accessibility. Magic the Gathering as a game itself has struggled with accessibility for many years, with core aspects of its property including a ludicrously high price point for competitive play, complicated mechanics, a confusing array of formats and legalities, a very stingy free-to-play online version, etc, etc. But for a good while, the story of the game, though complex in its own right, was one of the easiest ways to get interested in the game and contribute to this fandom. Now, with most things, there are two major kinds of accessibility: tangible accessibility and intangible accessibility, and I'd like to talk about them both. Whilst many of the issues and points I'm going to raise will specifically relate to the workings of Magic the Gathering story, I do want to ensure that nobody gets left behind with this discussion if they're not aware of the internal machinations of the 25-year-old narrative of a child's card game about furries and gay elves. As such, for the first half of this video, I'm going to explore these two forms of accessibility using examples from outside of Magic the Gathering. And to start with, I'm going to talk about performance poetry, because I wasted over 40 grand on an undergrad and a master's in this garbage, and god damn it, I want to talk about it! Part 1. Tangible accessibility. Performance poetry. Ooh. Before I uploaded a video about goblins and accidentally turned a burgeoning hobby into something I would soon have to start paying taxes on, my main creative outlet was spoken word or performance poetry. This is me doing a set up in Edinburgh for the goddamn debut slam. Look at me go. Sort of eyes all full of hope and... Oh, no, I completely forgot. I'm like drunk as shit here. I'm sorry, I'm downing white wine on stage. I forgot that. Maybe I should have used a different set. When I first started performing poetry, I had never written poetry before in my entire life. I hadn't even read much poetry outside of GCSE Wilfred Owen and A-level William Blake, and the only performance poetry I'd ever seen was Watsky's Tiny Glowing Lights Part 2, a Tim Key set from Live at the Apollo, and that one Harry Baker TED Talk that I swear every single undergraduate white dude in the UK cites as his slam poetry enlightenment moment. Despite my complete lack of knowledge about this genre, I decided to give it a go and went to my local open mic night, and about 3 years later I was helping to host and run my local area's biggest spoken word night. I'd found my voice within this art form that I'd never even heard of before I started uni, and due to the fact of how easy it was for me to give it a go and learn within it, it quickly became my primary form of artistic expression. I was also studying a spoken word module at my uni, but with how easy it was for me to access professional feedback, workshopping, and other influences through live events and online performances, I learned infinitely more outside of the classroom. That was mostly due to the fact that I came up in the Bristol scene, which is frankly one of the best in the UK, but it was also in part due to the fact that there wasn't any real academic writing on the subject of contemporary performance poetry, at least that didn't come in the form of elitist op-eds titled things like "The Cult of the Noble Amateur."
Why is the poetry world pretending that poetry is not an art form? I refer to the rise of a cohort of young female poets who are currently being lauded by the poetic establishment for their honesty and accessibility. Buzzwords for the open denigration of intellectual engagement and rejection of craft that characterizes their work. If we are to foster the kind of intelligent, critical culture required to combat the effects of populism in politics, we must stop celebrating amateurism and ignorance in our poetry.
Ah, holy shit, of course! The only way to revive liberalism is to boycott spoken word events! Have you been made poorer, disenfranchised, or otherwise disillusioned by the neoliberal economic policies that led to the global financial crash? Well, don't worry, Rebecca Watts is here to save you from the evil clutches of populism by telling you to stop enjoying Holly McNish. Also, a quick fucking editor's note, absolute bollocks on the idea that the poetry establishment is the one pushing up spoken word poets. The PN Review is the poetry establishment. It's been going since 1970. The poetry slams didn't start until 1984. What the fuck are you talking about? Ah! There's a haughty disdain for accessible art forms and accessibility within art that I have never understood. Getting more people access to and involved in art and entertainment is a good thing, and performance poetry as a genre has a great many accessible aspects. For one, there's no requirement for using any specific form, rhyming, rhythm, or language. Pieces can be verbatim monologues in English or full of intricate Portuguese multisyllabic schemes. All are equally valid. Outside of the form itself, the culture of performance poetry is one of solidarity and growth through support. The community knows that not every poet on stage is vying to be the next Danez Smith. Many poets just want a place to perform because they want to get something out. A performance poetry night is very much a space for both the audience and performer, and, unless you say something truly egregious, a performance poetry audience will still support you. If you want feedback and you want to improve, you often can ask the hosts, the audience, or the headline acts that you probably performed alongside after the event, and you'll definitely get some. Speaking of hosts, there's a great enthusiasm within performance poetry to match how the art form puts up very few barriers with ensuring that events themselves are physically accessible. I've met many hosts that turn down venues that aren't wheelchair accessible, for example. Obviously, this isn't the case everywhere, but from my experience of other art forms, live performance poetry events are more often than not some of the most accessible live art events that anyone can attend and engage with. Another cool aspect of the performance poetry scene is that most performances are recorded and put up on places like YouTube or SoundCloud, much like the one you're seeing now, for people to experience it if they missed an event. Poets like Savannah Brown have made entire careers off of posting their work to YouTube for free. These examples are what I mean when I say tangible accessibility within art. Aspects within your art form, event, or product that ensure that as many people as possible have the opportunity to access it, breaking down financial, ability-based, geographic, and other forms of barriers that stand in the way of someone's ability to get involved with and contribute to something. But ensuring that someone has tangible access to art and entertainment is one thing, you also have to ensure that the art and entertainment itself is accessible. And to explain the difference, I need to talk about the Chilcot Report, and frankly, I didn't see this coming either. In In 2016, up at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is something that happens in Scotland that nobody in Scotland wants to happen, there was a performance where the Chilcot Report, an inquiry into the actions of Tony Blair and his government in the lead up to the Iraq War, was read out non-stop by comedians, politicians, and members of the public at a free-to-enter event. As tangibly accessible as this event was, it was free to enter, free to contribute, wheelchair accessible, etc, etc, and as much as I think it did a good job to spark a discussion around the report, this event didn't make the report itself any more accessible to a wider range of people who otherwise wouldn't have read it, because it's 6,000 pages long and the performance and reading took over 2 weeks to complete. It also didn't help that the report itself is meticulous to a fault, often going into great detail about the precise words and terms used by ministers and ambassadors during dinner conversations, and absolutely laden with footnotes and references to other reports from a multitude of different sources. Accessibility doesn't just come in the form of not barring people from entering an event if they can't afford it. Accessibility also comes in the form of ensuring that people who are in an event don't need an in-depth understanding of legal documentation and early 2000s foreign policy to understand what the barreling fuck is going on. In my opinion, a piece of good art and entertainment is one where anyone experiencing it can get something out of it regardless of their background. If you're interested in reading the report or the mercifully shorter executive summary, which is a breezy 150 pages long, I'll put a link down below. But enough about my country's bastard warmongering ex-prime minister. I want to delve into this idea of intangible accessibility. And for that, I need to talk about this one terminal in the Hephaestus level in Bioshock 1. Part 2. Intangible access. Okay, so there's this one terminal in the Hephaestus level in Bioshock 1, and I've wanted to talk about it on this channel for so long. Bioshock is a video game where you shoot guns and bees at genetically modified monster people as you traverse an underwater collapsing city on a quest to eat as many children as you can so that you can upgrade your bee shooting abilities. Bioshock is also a game about class conflict, how capitalism necessitates inequality, and how, for the many, freedom and choice within a neoliberal economic system is, in the end, an illusion. Now, this game has been analysed far more in depth by people better than I am, such as Ryan Hollinger. Is it Hollinger or Hollinger? God, so I had to re-record this audio, and in the last one I said I needed to look up how to actually pronounce the name, and I didn't. So I'm gonna go with Hollinger for now. I'm really sorry, Ryan. I can't apologise enough. Such as Ryan Hollinger, whose analysis of horror media is some of my favourite on this site. Please do go check him out. I'm only going to talk about a few metaphors and moments within Bioshock that I believe to be good examples of intangibly accessible storytelling, and to do so, I do need to do a quick rundown of the story of the game for those who aren't aware. So, major spoilers for Bioshock 1 ahead. A game that came out in, hang on, 2007. Andrew Ryan is a self-made industrialist who believes in man's entitlement to the sweat of his brow. No taxes to the government, no penance to the church, no redistribution of wealth in any capacity. But employers disproportionately benefiting from the profits of their workers is fine because fuck you, this is my ideology, I get to make the rules! Ryan believes in a true laissez-faire capitalist dream where the phrase fuck you got mine reigns king, aka neoliberalism, the predominant ideology of most markets on Earth at time of recording, which believes that a deregulated free market is the most efficient method for allocating resources. But in Bioshock, it is turned up to 11 and made fashion. Ryan builds the base for his individualist utopia at the bottom of the ocean, calls it Rapture, and populates it with the best and the brightest scientists, artists, and industry leaders. Here, they can practice their work without fear of censorship or restriction in any capacity. As Ryan says, Rapture is a place where the great will not be constrained by the small. The outcome of this way of thinking is best exemplified in the character character of Dr. Steinman, a plastic surgeon in the game who, in the face of absolute deregulation, takes a shit ton of drugs, hallucinates that the goddess of beauty is speaking to him, and begins to shred motherfuckers like low moisture mozzarella. But it wasn't all a carefree playground of murder fun for the elites. After Rapture's construction, Ryan completely abandoned the massive workforce he'd hired to build the city in the first place, leaving them to fend for themselves, finding whatever jobs they could, and living in privately owned slums, many of them having to literally sell their children to survive. The massive inequality of working and upper class eventually came to a head in a civil war in 1949, which saw Ryan's elites and the police versus the rebellious working class, who were agitated into action by a character called Atlas. The war results in chaos and a horrendous death toll, which is not helped by the fact that everybody's been using genetic altering drugs which send them mad and or give them bee shooting powers. All of this happens before you arrive and is revealed to you as you play through the game, picking up audio logs, seeing the evidence of the Civil War, talking with characters, and slowly moving towards one of the most iconic twists and best metaphors in video game history. So let's talk about it. Oh shit, hang on, that's Ryan Hollinger's thing. How did I not catch that on the first take of this? Oh, okay, let me just quickly rewrite that. So let's just jump into it. Yeah, that was better. I don't think anyone's cornered the market on that one. During the game, you are given a number of tasks to complete and goals to achieve by various characters, but most notably, Atlas, the first friendly voice you meet as you enter the city. Atlas is a cheery Irish fellow who often asks you, would you kindly do this and that for him? Picking up a radio, finding his wife and child, kill the shit out of a barely disguised Ayn Rand analog, you know, the everyday requests. However, just before you confront who you assume to be the final boss of the game, Andrew Ryan, you're met with the realization that you have been manipulated through mind control to do whatever anyone asks of you, provided they use the activation phrase, would you kindly. Ryan showcases this during a cutscene where he uses the phrase to make you sit, run, and ultimately kill him. After this revelation and the death of Ryan, the game then hands you back control, just as Atlas uses this exact activation phrase on you to get you to put a DNA key into a terminal in the next room. I have a vivid memory of spending a good 5 minutes scouring the room for any alternative of doing what Atlas asked me when I first played this game. I hit every surface, trying to leave the way I came and bypass the choice until I had to resign myself to doing what Atlas said, knowing that he was manipulating me for some evil purpose. As I approached the terminal, I was suddenly struck by a realization that I did still technically have a choice here. I could just turn the game off, end the story here and not continue down this path. I technically did have a choice, but I still put the key in the machine, even though I knew I was being forced to, even though I knew I didn't want to, because the alternative choice wasn't a real choice. At the time, this moment got me thinking about the concept of false choice in a broad sense, as well as the notion that, hey, maybe games are a dope and unique method for delivering story. I first played Bioshock when I was about 15 or so, and it was the first piece of media that ever truly compelled me to become a writer. At the time, that's all I've really got out of it. But as my analytic abilities matured and my understanding about politics grew from virgin centrist to Chad leftist, I began to understand the deeper meaning behind this theme of false choice being placed in a story about a neoliberal apocalypse. What is choice under an economic system which can only ever allow a limited few to truly succeed? A capitalist housing market, for example, can only work if there are people without good quality or any form of housing. If everybody is living in good conditions, there's no one to sell houses to. Do people choose homelessness, choose poverty, choose addiction, choose crime, or are they forced into it, with the alternatives being technically possible, but not realistically tenable? In the food deserts of the US, like North and South Memphis, for example, your choice is to either eat fast food from one of many accessible corporate outlets and low-quality food from convenience stores, or to travel a number of hours, often by unreliable bus, to a distant supermarket to buy good or medium quality food and then travel all the way back and then cook. It is a choice in the loosest interpretation of the word, because it technically is your choice to not spend 3 to 5 hours of your day and a lot of effort to reach a supermarket and then come home and then spend even more time cooking, all whilst probably working a full-time job, if not multiple jobs. When the environment and your circumstance makes a choice so unappetizing or burdensome that even though you know it's better for you, you pick the other option, it's a choice in the same way I had the choice of turning off the game to spite Atlas, who actually turned out to be Andrew Ryan's rival, the mobster industrialist Frank Fontaine, but just with a fake accent. I love the fact that the game calls its two villains Andrew Ryan and Atlas. Like, Bioshock was subtle in some ways and beat you over the head in others, and I fucking love it. This theme of choice and the illusion thereof comes up again and again in Bioshock, with the illusionary choices of what brand of plasmid and or weapon you're going to buy and rank up, contrasted with the one meaningful choice in the game of whether to save the little sisters you find throughout Rapture or to viciously consume them! If you choose to save the little sisters, you individually become weaker by having less Adam, but you strengthen the last bastion of community left in Rapture, receive a few unique items, and get the good ending, where you adopt 4 daughters and pass away peacefully, knowing that your choices have benefited the many rather than just yourself. Whereas, if you choose to embrace the individualism promoted by Ryan and Fontaine and kill the little sisters for more Adam, you get the bad ending, where you don't get any nice daughters and instead you unleash a nuclear holocaust upon the world. There's also actually a third ending that you can only get if you choose to kill half of the little sisters and save the other half, but it's just the nuclear holocaust ending again with sadder music. If only my big brain could dissect what the game is trying to say about centrism and apoliticism during times of particular political struggle. Oh, the metaphor! It's just too fucking dense! What the inclusion of this theme and the juxtaposition of the superficial and impactful choices tells us is that whilst many choices presented to us by capitalism are either meaningless in the grand scheme of things or not really choices at all, we can make the choice to reject the cult of individualism that symbiotically drives and is rewarded by neoliberalism for a kinder economic system where the power, resources and capital held by the few are shared with those for whom the system has failed. As an adult, I understood the deeper metaphor in this theme of false choice, but as a teenager, this moment still struck and inspired me even though I didn't have all the pieces yet. I also feel like it's really necessary to refocus our perspective for a second and remember that all of these revelations came as a result of a video game about using slug juice to develop bee weapons, telling me to put a punch card into a terminal and me not wanting to. That is fucking nuts. Games kick ass. You could analyze this game for hours. You could analyze the would you kindly scene for hours, but to me, Bioshock has many phenomenal examples of intangible accessibility. It presents a multitude of ideas and narrative twists, and even if you didn't get them all on first blush, you doubtless still got something out of this moment. And it may have even acted as the first stepping stone to you understanding these broader economic ideas. Stories in games matter so much, in the same way that stories in films matter so much. They can elevate a mechanically enjoyable piece of media into something that stays with you, that even changes your perspective and inspires you. So now that we've spent a good 23 odd minutes talking about how important accessibility in art and entertainment is, let's move on to talking about Magic the Gathering. Part 3. The decline of accessibility. The current state of Magic the Gathering story. Okay, so we'll start when everything began to go the shape of a pear. In April 2018, Wizards of the Coast promoted Nic Kelman to Head of Story and Entertainment, and Kelman's first order of business was overhauling the delivery method and the authors of magic fiction. For over half a decade before this change, a team of creative writers within Wizards of the Coast had been producing freely available story articles to accompany everything from large set releases to supplementary free products like Commander, reposting old stories from Magic's past, and posting foreshadowing articles that would go on to set up future storylines for future sets. By the time that Khans of Tarkir was released in 2014, the articles produced by this team became the sole source for the central Magic storyline. Can we just forget that the comics exist for a little bit? I don't really know what, like, the state of the comics are, if they're canon or not. Can we also forget that Jewels of the Planeswalker exist? Before then, these story articles had been supplements to accompanying novels, which changed after Theros block. Coincidentally, this was the first time that I started playing Magic. It was during this period that we got iconic stories like the Truth in Names and the Flood, memorable moments like Ob Nixilis nearly drowning Gideon, and characters like the Raven Man, who, despite never actually being referenced or let alone printed on any official Magic the Gathering product, is still a fan favourite villain, more so than many villains who have actually seen printings. Also, for anyone that isn't aware, all of the stories from this period are all still free to access on Magic the Gathering's official website, which I'm just going to be calling the mothership for ease and convenience from now on. Due to their nature of being pieces of creative writing produced directly in-house, the overlap between the story of a set and the story of the fiction accompanying that set was nearly flawless. These two formats fed into each other as well, with the Magic fiction building characters and relationships in ways that cards alone may struggle to do, and the cards of Magic then also helped to summarize the narrative so that anyone who didn't have the time or inclination to read the articles themselves could still understand what was going on, and the cards also rewarded those who read the stories with small details in art or gameplay interactions. I remember first getting into the story and excitedly sharing the articles to my friends to keep them up to date, as well as discussing it with my LGS's Facebook group. The ease of access and shareability of the stories got a lot of established fans interested in diving in further. I personally fell down a rabbit hole of the MTG wiki to garner an approximate knowledge of the older Magic story. I mean, it was either that or spending money on a bunch of very poorly reviewed books, and funnily enough, I didn't want to do that. When Battle for Zendikar was announced, I was just as excited to see the return of Kalitas and Omnath as much as I was the return of Fetchlands, and only one of those things was bitterly disappointing. And then Kelman came in and, for whatever reason, decided that the system and authors that people had grown to know and love just wasn't cutting it anymore, and so he replaced the in-house team of creative writers with, quote, authors with chops. And that's why the prestigious and daunting task of producing Magic the Gathering's first physical novel in over a decade went to the guy who co-wrote Bionicle Mask of Light. Quick editor's note about that zinger. I don't particularly want to cut it because it is banging, but I also don't want to necessarily offend the Bionicle fans that may be in my audience. I too am a Bionicle fan. I love the Matanue. I love all the various Nue, in fact, and so I just want to let you know that, different fight, same struggle. And anyway, back to the video. So apart from a drastic increase in whackness, what are the major changes between our current era of storytelling in Magic the Gathering and the previous? To start with the tangible changes in accessibility, the first obvious one is that some of these novels now cost money to access, whereas they didn't before. It's not a bank-breaking amount, but putting up any financial barrier to access a previously free product automatically discourages people who either aren't able to or aren't willing to pay money for something they were able to get for free before from engaging with that something any further. It would be the equivalent of having gotten into performance poetry through the Button Poetry YouTube page and then all of a sudden after 5 years having to front up a couple of quid a month to keep accessing this thing that you're passionate about with no good reason given as to why it now costs money. This decision will only turn people off from reading Magic Story themselves, and any new audiences that the company may have gained from hapless bookstore shoppers will also be turned off from future installments because your flagship novel had spelling errors! Now, during the early days of the Kelman era of storytelling, we still got free story content, But here we ran into an additional issue. Whereas before almost all of the essential contemporary Magic story could all be found over on the mothership in weekly articles, there are now a plethora of different places that you need to pay attention to in order to understand the full scope of Magic's current narrative. There are the books and e-publications, but there are also the stories posted on the mothership, including Brandon Sanderson's Children of the Nameless, which you can't actually navigate to through the Magic the Gathering website, so if you didn't know it was already there, there's no way you can find it yourself. Like, Davriel's character icon on the story section of the mothership is literally just a JPEG. It doesn't link to anything. And it's the same with the Children of the Nameless story icon. Like, when you click it, it just drops down to a JPEG that has a very short summary of the novel that says available in print soon. Like, come on, you could hyperlink things in PowerPoint. I did that when I was 8. Why is there no link to it here? Ultimately, we'd like Magic to have the same high-quality reputation for fiction as we do art. Elspeth's character bio hasn't been updated since 2013, Nick. What are you talking about? There are also the free War of the Spark prequel chapters written by Django Rexler, which are pretty good, certainly leagues better than the actual monetized War of the Spark novel, but you could only access them as they were coming out if you were subscribed to a specific online service and then had the stories emailed to you. Bear in mind that these stories explained pretty important plot elements and introduced characters that were very relevant in the War of the Spark novel, and these came out 2 months after the novel's release, and were only accessible if you or someone else you knew had subscribed to the Penguin Random House newsletter. Thankfully, there are people like Voice of All who have made a full radio drama here on YouTube of each of Rexler's chapters, so if you missed out on this fiction, or didn't want to read a novel in your email, I keep going on about this, but whose idea was that? Then please do check them out. I even played Lazarv in one of the episodes, which, Mr. Russo, if you are watching this, I will gladly bend my knee to you and Mickey Monopoly Mouse if you let me play either Lazarv, Davriel Kane, Doretti, or a resurrected Slowbad. My email is spice8rack@gmail.com. My phone number is 07. For a time, it did look like Wizards was planning on retaining the freely accessible story in conjunction with a purchasable physical book. A month or so after War of the Spark, the novel's release, new story articles began appearing on the mothership which retold the War of the Spark story from a single character's perspective, a girl called Rat, who travelled the plane throughout the war and saw the majority of the story's big set pieces. Personally, I found these chapters to be frustrating more than anything, as the potential that new information was hidden in these Rat chapters, spoilers, it wasn't, meant that I had to effectively read even more of War of the Spark again, but I was okay with it as it felt like this was a trial at the idea of future stories being released for free online, whilst also physically printed as collector's items or the like. Hell, if Wizards of the Coast had done that with the in-house articles, I probably would have a physical copy of the Khan's Block story on my bookshelf right now, as well as Shadows over Innistrad, Amonkhet, and Ixalan, show my appreciation for the stories of sets I truly loved. But that never happened. The last of these Rat chapters was published on June 12th of 2019, and nothing has been published under the Magic Story heading since, effectively signalling the death of a column that had been running for 7 years prior. But it's not just the physical accessibility to and the reputation of Magic Story which has taken a nosedive. Back when the story was in the hands of an in-house creative team, the quality of the writing was not just higher, but, as I've said before, the fiction was also infinitely more cohesive with the story that was told on the cards of any given set. If you missed the weekly story articles, or weren't invested enough to read them, you could still have an informed conversation with someone about Magic Story, because, more often than not, the events in Magic's fiction and the events on Magic's cards were one and the same. If you want your game's story to have a reputation as renowned as its art, ensuring that people can pick up a set of cards and at least understand the major story beats of your grand narrative is a really basic step. Let's consider Shadows over Innistrad, a story that I completely missed when it came out at the same time as most of my second year uni deadlines, but despite missing all but the first 2 articles, my experience with playing the set and keeping up to date with the previews gave me a pretty clear understanding of the story itself, so much so that the only things I found that I'd missed when I read the articles after my deadlines was that Soren got trapped in a wall and that Emrakul had manipulated both Nissa and Tamio to trap herself in Innistrad's moon. Compare this experience to that of the lore-interested player who is trying to get to grips with the contemporary story of Magic the Gathering through just playing a set like, I don't know, War of the Spark. Angrath has Amass, the mechanic that represents Bolas's army of Eternals. That means he's on Bolas's side, right? Nope, he is 100% Team Gatewatch. We see multiple cards showcasing Sorin and Nahiri's battle, and we even get a reference to him escaping from his wall. Does the story explore either of these two massive narrative moments? Nope, Sorin and Nahiri barely get mentioned in the book, and neither of them have a single line. Holy shit, is that the Chain Veil being destroyed alongside Bolas's Gem of Becoming in the artwork of Finale of Eternity? Nope. That just doesn't happen, and was probably a big miscommunication between departments. But don't worry, if you read War of the Spark Forsaken, you'll get to see Liliana Vess just leaving the Chain Veil on the floor at one point. Just putting it down and leaving it. That's it. That's the end of the Chain Veil, which, I don't know, seems like nearly half a decade of storytelling suggested that potentially that wasn't going to be the end for this all-powerful artifact. I don't know, man. But sure, God damn it. There are a whole host of inconsistencies and continuity issues surrounding War of the Spark, which I go much more into detail about in my Planeswalker nitpicking video. In the previous storytelling age of Magic, the divide between players who kept up to date with the story and players who didn't was a slim line of knowing the particulars of inter-character relationships. Now, the people who don't read the stories and those who do will have two completely different understandings of what the actual canon of this game is. It is fine to not cram your entire story into the cards of a game, but teasing players with the promise of finding out what the real story of a set is, provided they pay a little bit more than they're already doing, is insultingly whack. For all of Kelman's talk about wanting to improve the reputation of Magic's story, this game's fiction now has a reputation of being a deeply complicated and inconsistent narrative that the company has had to apologize for and that you have to pay for. All things which are making it more and more inaccessible, both for people who would want to get into it and for people who are trying to stick with it. And even when the stories are halfway decent, such as the Wildered Quest, there's still a chasm of difference between how the story used to be told versus how it is now. Compare the narrative of Khans of Tarkir, Fate Reforged, and Khans of Tarkir, but worse. Not only was every legendary creature in this set showcased in some capacity throughout the narrative, but all of them were given their own personal short chapter to shine and develop. Without them, we wouldn't know that Alessia is trans, or that Sidisi is planning on killing Solumgar with the poison she's literally brewing inside the hole where her heart used to be. Holy shit, that's metal as fuck. All of these stories made these characters feel fleshed out, made them more than just pictures on a piece of cardstock, and they also acted as a great way of getting people to take the step from playing the game to reading the story. Are you building a Dragon Lord Kolaghan commander deck? Why not see her in action in this official story article? Hey, why not learn more about this world whilst you're here? You could even look at some of the tales from Magic's pasts and get into— wait, hang on, why are you building a Dragon Lord Kolaghan commander deck? Stop that! Stop that immediately! In the Wildered Quest novel, by comparison, only 9 of the prospective 23 legendary creatures are even mentioned, and only 7 of them are given anything more than a brief cameo. Where is the people's Grumgully short story, Kate Elliott? You have failed to provide the people of this world with our deserved Grumgully short story. It's frustrating when the history of Magic has conditioned us to expect that legendary creatures presented in the game will have some significance to the story, and then they just don't. Not only does this make the game feel emptier, but it further widens the disconnect between the game and its narrative. All of this came to a head with Theros Beyond Death and M20, the first 2 standard sets since 2012 to ever be released with absolutely no story attached to them whatsoever. Okay, well, technically, Theros Beyond Death had a story, but it was deemed not well vetted enough or whatever, and so instead of getting a story, we got these random blurbs, again misspelt, and we also got the Theros story summary, which was met with a mixture of anger, confusion, disappointment, and frustration. And if I wanted Magic Story to remind me of my sex life, I would just rewatch the War of the Spark animated trailer where a handsome prince gets stabbed in the back by a heartless monster. The reason that Wizards cited for their need to overhaul their vetting process was the, quote, blowback from the War of the Spark Forsaken novel, the terrible writing and apology-provoking biphobia of which, by the way, you too can own in hardback for almost $30. Alternatively, if you'd like to find out what happened in this dreadful book that now is unfortunately canon, I'd recommend heading over to the Vorthos Cast and the Loregoyfs podcast on SoundCloud, where they break down and discuss everything that happened in the story for free. It's a real shame that a combination of hit or miss writers, a lack of communication between story and design teams, confusion over canon, sudden paywalls, and a difficulty of finding and accessing the story has led to not only the axing of a greatly anticipated story of a long-awaited set, but also a notable lapse in players' interest and enthusiasm with the story of the game. I mean, I made a joke about it in my last video about how my Wildered Quest audiobook speedrun didn't do so well, but when you compare the commentary around this pretty okay book with the one that everybody knew was absolutely trash, it seems that people aren't that interested in the story right now, more so seeing just how bad it can get. Which I guess is kind of a way of making it more accessible. Hey, maybe Wizards has actually, like, big-brained me on this one. You know what? If this was the aim, credit where credit's due, Nic Kelman, you're a genius. During their "We're sorry you were so upset that we had to cancel the story" post, WotC also celebrated both the success and reception of the Wildered Quest before saying they'll return to this EPUB strategy with Ikoria's release, which... can I just say how cynical this is? Wizards first hides the story of their game behind a paywall, and then, when people pay the toll, they laud it as a success and use the sales to justify continuing the strategy. This isn't a new and optional product that people have leapt on and enjoyed like Modern Masters, or a collectible physical copy of the story. This is something that's existed in the game since its inception. For fans of the story, the choice between forking over a few quid or not continuing to engage with this narrative that they've become invested in is a false choice. This isn't a celebration of a new era of storytelling, it's a celebration of a successful price hike. There still are glimmers of the accessible fiction that Magic used to sport. Brandon Sanderson produced an entire novella that requires almost no understanding of the wider Magic canon to enjoy, that is free to read online, and it's easily the best piece of Magic fiction to be produced under Kelman's tenure, and potentially one of the best pieces of Magic fiction, full stop. In doing my research for this video, I dug up why it was that Children of the Nameless Out of Everything is indeed free, and it turns out that Sanderson insisted that it be freely available to read in exchange for writing the novella for free. He even waived any profits that may come from a physical printing of the story, instead asking for them to be donated to charity. And it's kind of mad to compare this instance of an internationally recognized and celebrated author producing a bunch of free work for a game he loves to the Nic Kelman quote where he insists that Magic didn't have a good reputation for its story. Yet another editor's note. I can only apologise for the sheer quantity of these in this video, but when you predominantly produce content centred around Magic the Gathering, often something will happen mid-edit that forces you to rewrite large swaths of your script. Turns out, there's a reason why we can no longer access Children of the Nameless from the Magic the Gathering mothership. So, Children of the Nameless had been free to access since its publication in December of 2018, but, as I found out, as I was editing this section, it has been taken down because Wizards is planning on selling the novel physically. Now, to be clear, Sanderson was consulted about this decision, but he also clearly says that this wasn't necessarily what he wanted, and the proceeds of the novel are still going to charity. Well, sorry, the proceeds of the novel that would have been going to Sanderson are going to charity, and an indeterminate sum of Wizards' profits will be too. Now, this move is perplexing to me, as it is to members of Sanderson's team, for a number of reasons. First, this flies in the face of Sanderson's original wishes and intent for his novella. Bear in mind that he did agree to write all of this for free on only 3 conditions, and now one of them has been vetoed 2 years after the novella's publication. Again, Sanderson was consulted about it, and it says it was, quote, within the scope of what could have happened with the story whilst the deal was being hammered turned out, so it isn't anything legally underhanded, it's just corporately underhanded. Next, this story had been free to read and download for over 2 years before this paywall got put up. A paywall that granted all of Sanderson's earnings from, and some of Wizards of the Coast's earnings from, will go to Child's Play, but a paywall nonetheless. We don't know yet how much the book will cost, and because the story has been up for some time and has been free to download for so long, you more than likely know someone who has a free PDF version that you can still read. But for newer players, this is yet another example of Wizards making it a little bit harder and a little bit more expensive to get into the story. I mean, Children of the Nameless could have remained on the mothership as well as being physically printed. There is no reason for why it is gone now. Anyone who's read the novel, who is now considering buying it, would have bought it anyway if it remained free to access, much like I was talking about earlier with the whole collector's editions of the free-to-read story articles that Wizards used to print. I mean, I saw the argument a lot on Twitter whilst people were beginning to realise, hey, the book's just disappeared. The only way to get a hardback copy of Children of the Nameless is to remove the free version of Children of the Nameless, because otherwise there's no incentive to buy it. And sure thing, Doug. That's why Seb McKinnon's website doesn't have any of his art on there. Because if you can just access it for free and print it out yourself, why would you ever buy a physical copy? It's such a disingenuous and weird argument. I do want to emphasize that Sanderson himself has encouraged people to buy this novel, although I would like some clarification from Wizards of the Coast as to exactly how much of their prospective profits would also be donated to charity. Anyone who is familiar with the literary industry knows that the bulk of the profits from the sale of a book will go to distributors and publishers rather than the authors themselves, depending on their deal. And also, Del Rey isn't mentioned at all in this clarification post, so there's a good chance that absolutely none of the profits that Del Rey would make from the printing of this novel would go to charity, which overall just seems kind of slimy more than anything else. Also, and this is just a general query, why on earth did all of these confirmations come from Sanderson himself and not Wizards of the Coast or Del Rey? Why is it the author's responsibility to straighten out the confusion over Wizards' actions when they no longer even own the rights to the book they're talking about anymore? Wizards, your parent company, earned $4.72 billion last year, and Magic the Gathering boasted a 30% increase in revenue. For God's sake, hire a PR department! Comedically overstated, but not necessarily insincere frustration aside, the intentions of Brandon Sanderson here were admirable, and it really is heartening to see that there are still people willing to put in the time and effort, often for free, to promote accessibility to the story of this game, and to promote accessibility to and within media in general, such as the many content creators who have built hobbies and careers around this game. People like the aforementioned Voice of All and Coach over at the Card Bazaar create unofficial audiobooks and history readings of Magic's deeper lore. Coach's audiobook of The Thran was an absolute godsend when it came to my research for my Yawgmoth video, for example. Magic Arcanum is of course a great source for current Magic story, but you didn't need me to tell you that, as well as the Vorthos Cast and the Loregoyfs, who delve into Magic's history alongside other podcasts like the Goblin Lore podcast and Red Mage Blue Mage. Other creators like Trapixieum explore the lore whilst doing character work and skits, like in this video where he delves into the story of Maren the Mornsong. I'm also a big fan of the more tongue-in-cheek creators who also talk about Magic's lore and story, like Lily Harron, aka Lily Library, who, as well as doing ASMR readings of Frankenstein, also produces videos like Every Legend in Theros Beyond Death ranked by how much I wish it had a story, and Every Girl in War of the Spark ranked by how much I want them to top me, which is frankly that good shit that I am here for, that good shit that I also do crave. There's also Ravnican Artist, who has a great series of videos analysing the art associated with each guild of Ravnica, exploring both the pieces in a vacuum, but also what the overall tapestry of pieces says about the guild. More of a reader? Well, there are tons of blogs and writers out there producing all kinds of work around Magic the Gathering's lore, all entirely free. Dragonclaw Writing, for example, is a blog exploring story, themes, issues of representation, and a lot more. There's also great fan fiction being produced in lieu of Theros' story, such as those being posted by various authors over at mtglore.com, a site which also acts as a great navigation tool to find previous Magic the Gathering stories and lore resources. Please do go check out all of the channels and sources I've listed, they're all in the description. As pants as the state of the story is right now, I'd much prefer this video acts as a celebration of the quality nature of how Magic Story used to be, and the continued work of the creators and entertainers who are keeping things accessible. And that's where part 4 of this video comes in. Part 4. Yeah, bet you forgot there were parts to this video, didn't you? Got ya. You prick. As I said, I first got into Magic around the time that the story transitioned from paid novels to the free, in-house story articles that I still love. But I am aware that not everybody who wants to has experienced them yet. And that's why, starting at 2 PM GMT on April 3rd, it was originally going to be in March, but then I got ill and had to kind of postpone everything. So it's April 3rd now. I will be live streaming, reading as many of these story articles as I can out loud over the course of 24 hours whilst raising money for Help Bristol's Homeless. Help Bristol's Homeless is a charity based in Bristol which builds micro homes out of shipping containers to act as temporary accommodation for rough sleepers in the city and the surrounding area. They are fully private places to live and act as a home base and address so that homeless people can have easier access to basic things like mail, the ability to register to vote, and ultimately a roof over their head for anything from a few weeks to a couple of years until they get a more permanent place to live. They also have a transitionary system in place for people who struggle with going from rough sleeping to a private bedroom immediately, and the site is LGBTQ+ friendly. I visited the site mid-February, and seeing the quality of the homes and speaking to one of the residents about his experience with the charity really enthused me to do some fundraising for them. Help Bristol's Homeless are also currently in the process of expanding their site by installing an additional communal space that can host things like CV writing workshops, practical art classes, and a range of other things, all volunteer-led and run. Everybody who works for the charity is a volunteer, they derive all of their funding and resources from the community, and all of their funding goes into maintaining, improving, and expanding the range of facilities on the site. I am exceptionally lucky that one of the biggest issues in my life right now is that the card game story that I sometimes talk about isn't quite as good as it used to be, and I've wanted to use this platform that you've all afforded me for good for a while now. So please do join me between the 3rd and 4th of April. Again, please cut a man some slack. A man was ill. 2 PM GMT is the start time to watch me and hopefully a couple of guests journey through Magic Story from Khans of Tarkir onwards whilst raising money for a good cause. I'll be putting 100 quid in, which is about as much money as I get from YouTube advertising, thank God for Patreon and Channel Fireball, to get the ball rolling, but any donations or signal boosting you could do would be greatly appreciated. Once again, that's 2 PM GMT over on twitch.tv/Spice8Rack. Speaking of Patreon and things being greatly appreciated, it's time for the credits! I'd like to do a massive shout out to all of my $10 patrons, including Adam Gable, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists Booker Idaka, Anthony G. Reap, Bambi Roper, Bassick, Brian Dunn, Chase Beard, Chris DeVos, Causa, Darius Rudeminer, David Vestal, Drew Pierce, Dystopico, Exidian, Erica Hamel, Ethan Abraham, Flame Consumes, Georgi Lyubanov, Hoopered Up, In Response I Bolt Myself, Jake Colburn, Jessica Settle, John Solog, I hope I got that right, Joshua M. Stephan, Kalia Withart, Keezy Peasy, Kieran Pollard, Kurt Ape Apologizer, Kirsten and Gabriel, Lachlan McAllister, Lady Epona, Leftist Tech Support, Liliana Vess, Queen of Discard, Lily Lord, Literally a Ghost That Pushes Over Candles, Linnea, Magic Arcanum, Matty, O, Tag 1, Megan Kernan, Mai, Mordella Morana, Mr. Skolaton, Ross King, Sasha Evelyn Francis, Sen, Silent Celine, Sky Johnson, Solace Ike, Spooksman, Stingray, Swan Hunter, the best Swans player in Montreal, the suavest Orange, Velen Belerin, Vittorio Grace, Vladimir Gorvikov, Xenon, and Zoltai. A massive shout out to all of the rest of my absolutely wonderful patrons, as well as Tappy Toe Claws for providing her voice for this very long video, and as always, stay spicy.